Well, thank you very much for that indeed. Much appreciated. Thank you. And lovely to see so many of you here this evening. Especially to see in the audience so many current and former students, because most of you will have been through that exercise with me where we talk about the relationship between history, particularly contemporary British history, and the sense of what it is to be British and have a sense of British identity. And we often do an exercise, don't we? Those of you who've done this can nod away if you like. Often do an exercise whereby we kind of try and see how far we can get into that discussion without somebody mentioning Winston Churchill or the Second World War. And perhaps not surprisingly, we don't get very far before those Second World War related themes start to emerge in the conversation. Maybe also not particularly surprisingly, the First World War never emerges in the conversation. So we have embedded in our minds really this very much this idea that the Second World War is a moment of national pride, success, positive achievement, the spirit of the Blitz, all those kind of things that we think about associated with the Second World War. And of course, those of you old enough to remember, way back at the start of this century, the BBC ran its programme looking at the greatest ever Britons, and in its top 10 was Winston Churchill, and there was a series of television programmes in which we were all kind of campaigned to see one individual or another as the best Briton. And of course, Winston Churchill was the person who emerged at the top of that list. Not Douglas Haig, for example, the British general from the First World War. Why is this? Well, perhaps not surprisingly, the First World War is associated continually with a narrative of futility, failure of leadership, lack of compassion for the men, a war that seems to have been a pointless war of no kind of relevance to our society today. Whereas, as I say, the Second World War bathed very much in that kind of Churchillian rhetoric of this being Britain's finest hour. There is, however, much more similarity between the wars than perhaps sometimes is acknowledged. In particular, although with regard to the Second World War, we retrospectively think of it very much as being a war against the evils of Nazism, there's a whole parallel history where Nazi Germany stayed within its boundaries, and where actually the British might have been well and truly happy to contain them within Germany and let them do what they wanted within their own country. So it was really only that sense of the balance of power and Britain's empire being at threat which really drew Britain into the Second World War. And those were exactly the same reasons that Britain went to war for in 1914. So in terms of motivation and the primary concerns of the British leaders, you've got that connection, that similarity between the two conflicts. Both wars, of course, also involved very similar challenges. In both wars, the professional army was small, though I think larger than it is today. And to cope with the challenges of total warfare on a global scale, then those armies had to be expanded to bring in citizens. In the First World War, in the first instance, that was through voluntary recruitment, and then from 1916 onwards, it was through conscription. The start of the Second World War, we have conscription from the outset, and that is one way in which the Second World War learnt from the lessons of the First, because they didn't have the same debate, they didn't faff around, if you like, in the same way as they did in the First World War. They immediately kind of introduced conscription. But there you go, learning from the methods and the approaches from the First World War. And one of the things I'm going to be emphasising all the way through is the extent to which the First World War offered a model for how a lot of things happened in the Second World War, how there is a continuing relationship between the two. I think it's really important to bear in mind that many of the people who went to war in 1418 were again the people who actually faced active service in 39-45, or if not that, certainly lived through both conflicts, and the people who ran the institutions of government. Again, you've got that continuation of personnel. So lots of ways in which the two wars were very much linked together, and a lot of the developments in state policy across that period, 1914 to 1945, and probably a little bit onwards, were often driven much more by the idea of creating through the state a warfare state rather than what we tend to think of now as a welfare state. And indeed, many of the apparently welfare interventions were interventions that were coming much more from a motivation of making sure that Britain had the fit population that could go out and populate the empire, but also crucially, of course, defend the empire as well. So it was that warfare state mentality which really very much dominated. As I say, also that kind of sense of Britain's imperial mission in the world. It's worth bearing in mind that all 5 of Britain's prime ministers during the First and the Second World Wars, so that's Asquith, Lloyd George, Neville Chamberlain, Winston Churchill, and Clement Attlee, because it's often forgotten about the last 2 or 3 months of the war were under Attlee's leadership. 3 different parties there, Liberal, Conservative, Labour. They all had the very same mindset, really, in terms of what Britain's place was in the world. They were all imperialists. They were liberal imperialists, they were socialist imperialists, they were conservative imperialists, but they were all imperialists. So we need to understand those common attitudes and common approaches which existed across. I think also, most military historians now would talk very much about how there were lessons learnt from the First World War that play a part in the way in which the military side of the Second World War was conducted as well. And again, moving us away from this idea of the First World War negative, Second World War a positive experience. So that's one of the things I want to explore a little bit more. So that sense really that the First World War in many ways provided a blueprint for things that were done in the second. On this slide here, I've put a couple of statements about each of the wars with a contradiction within them to show that you can present both apparently positive or apparently negative assessments of both conflicts. So, of course, depending on your standpoint, it's very easy, therefore, to, in an evidence-based narrative, to present a version of the wars that might conflict with the next person's. And I think that is one of the key things that we need to bear in mind with history and indeed how we approach problems in the present day as well, that there's a tendency to move very quickly to one version of an event or one version of a problem, and therefore to say that this is the solution or that's who's to blame. And I think what we see if we just ask these kind of questions and see the kind of contradictions that exist with regard to both wars, there are different coexisting narratives about them, which both sets are true. Neither set is the only part of the story. And I think that's the challenge in particular with the First World War, that any attempt to, certainly in public discourse for most of the past kind of 100 years or so, has been kind of increasingly drowned out by the much more negative assessments, particularly since the end of the Second World War, particularly since the 1960s. And again, I might touch on that a little bit more in a moment. So what I'd like to do in the remainder of this lecture is perhaps just remind us of the reasons for those negative perceptions of the First World War. Where have those viewpoints come from? How has our collective understanding of the First World War been shaped into one in which probably most of you in the room, when you think of the First World War, tend to think in terms of that kind of trenches and tragedies label that Neil mentioned earlier on. What he didn't mention is that I found out I was teaching that module at lunchtime on an away day in my first week at the university, and as everyone else was sitting down to the lunch on the away day, a man turned up in a white van and took me to campus to tell me I was teaching this module. So I had about half an hour in the journey to decide what that was going to look like on that first day. It went well, but I can't tell you what I did. I can't remember. But as I say, most of us will have had that kind of trenches and tragedies idea in our heads. So try and look at where that's come from. Look at how historians have challenged these representations of the 1914-18 experience, and then maybe through just looking at some case study work around my own research on the medical history of the World Wars, show very much how there's a positive narrative to say about the First World War, how it set lots of lessons in place which were then kind of drawn upon in the second conflict. I would like to also briefly highlight some of the generalizations about the Second World War experience, and in doing so, emphasise a little bit that theme of public history that Neil mentioned at the start, especially kind of challenging some of the myths around the experience of the E-Day, the experience of the Blitz, the idea of the home front, the extent to which there were actually, again, several different types of experience that people had of the war rather than being a single kind of British experience. And certainly some of those myths that we sometimes get presented as everyone was in it together and a classless society had emerged and all those kind of things, how historians have broken down those narratives in recent years. And again, I've done some work that hopefully has contributed a little bit to that. Neil said some very kind things about my commitment to teaching and the student community at the university earlier on. And I think part of the reason why I'm stood doing a professorial talk tonight was recognition of my commitment to teaching and the student community. So what I'd like to do also is draw attention to some of the achievements of our students, how our students have the ambition to go on and be part of challenging some of these myths around both wars that I've mentioned already. And then finally, I'd like to just go back to the First World War centenary commemorations and some debates around what those commemorations were meant to achieve, look at what they've achieved, and then leave us with a question about how valuable we think the kind of trenches and tragedies narrative is around the First World War and how far collectively we should be moving our mindset from that, or whether we all think there might be a value in having a war that's represented in such a way. So at the end of the First World War, I don't know if I can dig it out. I might disconnect this microphone if I try and fight for it now. It's sitting. Oh no, it's not fighting back. I don't think. Yeah. So here I've got. It's certainly not as polished as the one on the screen, and it's long since parted from its medal ribbon. But I've got my great uncle's First World War service medal, and as you can see on the screen, what it says on the back is the Great War for Civilization. I can remember which pocket I put it in now, otherwise there'll be a panic later. The Great War for Civilization. That sums up the sense of achievement that the British had at the end of the war and the sense of purpose that the war had been about. So that when you read things from the 1960s, 70s and 80s and say, oh, it was all pointless, that is not how people in 1918 saw it. And yes, this has come from the elite, but lots of people throughout all layers of society believed that it had been about something. It had been worth fighting. Douglas Haig, who many of you will have heard of and who's parodied as the worst of the butchers and bunglers from the First World War, was not unpopular with the men during the war itself, and was certainly not unpopular in the decade after the war, before he died in 1928. And anybody who knows anything about the Poppy Fund will know that it was originally called the Haig Fund, and Haig played a part in that, which again runs counter to the idea that he didn't have any kind of sense of understanding about what the impact of the war had been, or that he didn't care about the men in any way. And when his funeral came in 1928, you can see the streets of London were well and truly packed with mourners. That the war was worth fighting as well is something that we see from kind of Edwardian literature, writers like H.G. Wells, for example. This book actually comes out during the war, I think in 1916, but it picks up on some things that you might have come across if any of you have read The 39 Steps by John Buchan, or you've come across the Riddle of the Sands by Erskine Childers, which was also made into a film with Jenny Agutter and Michael York in the 1970s. It's not got a cast of thousands in, but it's quite entertaining how two Englishmen messing about in boats in the North Sea managed to thwart a kind of a German invasion and even have a comic encounter with the Kaiser. But they all kind of captured this sense that kind of Britain's liberal system was under threat as a result, primarily by the 1910s. This sense of it's primarily under threat from Kaiserism, Wilhelminism, whatever you want to call it, kind of the Germany, basically. Of course, simultaneously, in German society, there was lots of literature talking about how awful the English were, these terrible people that had gone around the world conquering bits of it and then imposing a certain set of its values and saying to everybody, there you go, there's a global system. So there's two sides to looking at this, but certainly the British elite and H.G. Wells is doing a good job there, I think, of kind of capturing that sense, felt that civilization was indeed under threat. Here we've got the journalist Hall Caine, who's got a kind of Edwardian version of towels on the sun lounges in terms of talking about the kind of conflict between kind of what he sees as the great British virtues and all the terrible things that are represented by the German Empire under the Kaiser. Another theme that runs through it quite a lot as well is this idea that one of the problems with the British character was that it was a bit lazy, a bit too prone to kind of self-congratulation, and was missing kind of the threats to its existence. There's a complacency there. This feeds into all sorts of things, and again links through to what I was saying at the start around interest in welfareism and so on, and education for the masses, because it's not really that necessarily all these people care very much about the masses, but we need them to be educated enough to be able to compete with the German threat. We need them to be fit enough in order to be called up into the forces if that's what we need them to do. Again, you kind of get this sense that the nation needs to have a stronger sense of its duty and its responsibility. This is reflecting the huge debate that there was in Edwardian society before 1914 about whether conscription should have been introduced in peacetime, and that was one of the big political divides of the Edwardian era, with the Conservatives as the pro-conscriptionists very much on the losing side, the Liberals kind of being against that, and indeed the fact that you've got a Liberal government or a Liberal-dominated government in Britain until 1916 explains the slow, gradual shift towards conscription, which this is clearly part of that debate. Historians, I think people like Katrina Pennell in particular recently, have done a lot of work to demonstrate that actually most of the population were not going around on a day-to-day basis talking about the threat to English or British civilization or worrying about the long-term fate of the empire or anything like that. And if they were patriotic in a fairly quiet, undemonstrative kind of way. Yes, people took to the streets in 1914, believe it or not, cheering the war, great idea. There were actually some smaller, though not massively smaller, but some smaller demonstrations against the war just before it was called finally by Asquith. Most people didn't take to the streets at all. A bit like today. People were not that different to how we are today. We see people protesting in London, don't we? I mean, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but actually, if you think about it, most people who live in the country don't go on those kind of marches. They don't protest, and that was the case in 1914. Peter Simpkins, who did a book called Kitchener's Army, I hope I'm getting that right. Apologies to Peter if I'm not. In that, he demonstrated that the idea of a rush to colours, again, was also a little bit of a myth, and certainly the volunteering, I suppose, took off more once the professional army had gone off to Mons and there started to be reports of what had happened. And again, the other images that you see of kind of crowded streets and people kind of waving them all off to war and looking patriotic, they're after the war's been declared, and they're, whilst in a way, I guess clearly they're about supporting the war, they were more about supporting the men going off to fight. It was cheering on their friends and relatives who were going off and saying, "See you at Christmas," kind of thing, when you come back, when it's all over. Because of course that's the other thing we have to bear in mind in terms of this popular psyche in 1914, is that most people were expecting a fairly quick war based on myths of what the Franco-Prussian War had really been like. So they were not expecting these men to be away for years. Now, Robert Bruffaut, kind of a Frenchman who served alongside Britons on the Western Front, says the same thing, but in a slightly less kind way about the British, as you can see here from his reference to kind of the dim mind of the average khaki-clad wage earner, but kind of pointing out that if there was the patriotism, it's kind of a bit of a quiet patriotism, and people might almost to a degree have thought whoever the government said was a problem at that particular time. And certainly, I mean, joking apart, there were people in 1914 who still couldn't get over the fact it wasn't the French that we were fighting, it was the Germans. Briffaut also, as you can see, was not a huge fan of British or English culture, really, and certainly hadn't enjoyed his trip to Wimbledon by the sounds of things. I've only ever seen the tennis. I've never been to Wimbledon, so I don't know if that's a fair assessment of Wimbledonians or other than the Wombles, of course. But I don't think he'd ever encountered any of that. But seriously, I mean, there is a popular patriotism, but it's not something that people are talking about all the time. But it must have been there to a degree. Otherwise, how did the society sustain itself throughout those 4 years of war? Why did people carry on fighting? Why did they carry on working in the factories? Why did they put up with the risks, the privations, and all the things that we associate with war? Why did they react to victory in the way they did as well? Notwithstanding, as the war progressed, there was a real sense that, we can't just rely on patriotism to keep people going. And indeed, even patriotism itself around the empire made an effort to kind of slightly reinvent itself. So there was a slight democratizing of the relationships in the empire. Lloyd George had his Imperial War Cabinet that had representation from all of the dominions. It did have Indian representation on it as well, although of course that was white British representation that was there for the most part for India. But the Dominion Prime Ministers or representatives of the Dominion governments were part of this kind of network of an Imperial War Cabinet. And Jan Smuts, the South African politician, went on to be Prime Minister of South Africa in 1919. And I think this fact is correct, but someone will Google it and correct me. But I think he was the only leading political statesman to sign the Treaty of Versailles and also sign the charter that established the United Nations. So is a link with the end of both wars as well. Well, there he is, South African, and he's talking about the empire as the only successful experiment in international government that has been made, the British Empire. So it's really about a network of good governance. It's not British imperial self-interest. So kind of during the war, this reinvention of the purpose of the empire. But even that's not enough to kind of justify the war to people as it drags on. The original meaning of patriotism, even the original meaning of standing up for Belgian independence, much as that was an excuse anyway. But even those original meanings, they start to be lost particularly by 1917, when there's a fear of kind of war weariness coming intellectually from both the left and the right as well. And obviously when you get the events in Russia of 1917, a real sense that we need to offer the people something a bit more than fighting for the king, fighting for the empire, the sense of kind of patriotic values. So you get other things that come into the mix as well. The land fit for heroes. And I have a student in the room somewhere, Alicia, who's currently doing her master's dissertation, master's dissertation on the extent to which there was ever a will for a land fit for heroes, and in particular looking at its failure in rural Derbyshire. So look out for that when it's published later. So these promises of the war being about creating a better society, and even bigger than that, it's going to be the war that's going to stop war. There ain't going to be any more wars. So all these massive hopes, bits of propaganda, promises for the future. Lloyd George, of course, as Prime Minister, particularly kind of dresses himself up in the clothes of the land fit for heroes with his Ministry of Reconstruction and his promises about jobs, promises about housing in particular, all of those things. And I suppose for a decade or so after the end of the war, those things kind of people, they were good, and to a degree people felt that they were being delivered on. By the time you get to the end of the 1930s, although And again, this is where there's myths, isn't there? And I can see Kath right in my eyeline, and I know she teaches this period, but there's lots of myths about the 20s and the 30s, because actually for most people, if you were in a family where people were in work, the standard of living got better. This was the era of people living in smaller family units, in better houses, going on annual holidays and all those kind of things. Unfortunately, what we know is there were also huge visible pockets of deprivation, which were visibly invisible or invisibly visible, how you want to put it, but which became part of the memory after the Second World War, that the entire promise of a land fit for heroes had failed. And that sense of that failing is part of what becomes a narrative about what was the First World War for. It was the elite running the country badly, taking us into a war that was meaningless, exploiting the population, and then there wasn't even any kind of reward afterwards. And then, of course, this veteran of the First World War that we see on the screen there, with his moustache styled slightly differently to what you might be most familiar with, when he rises to power in Germany in the 1930s, then increasingly a sense and hopes for the war to end wars are also disappointed, to say the least. So the Second World War, of course, then becomes this huge national event, certainly killing off the idea at the end, the war to end all wars. And whilst, of course, there was during the First World War bombing of UK civilian targets, the scale of that is much greater during the Second World War. The memory of that and how the British population coped with that becomes embedded within popular culture, within the popular memory, and does become part of that idea of the Second World War being a war that where we were genuinely under threat and where it had a genuine purpose. And of course, it was the right war to fight, and therefore is part of that, lending that narrative of positivity around the Second War compared to the growing negativity around the First World War that I mentioned a little bit earlier. The British at war between 39 and 45 was very much an imperial Britain at war. One of the things that was used in propaganda to reassure the British that victory would ultimately be ours was that sense that even in the worst possible moment in 1940, at the time of the threat of invasion and the eve of the Battle of Britain, we still had the Empire sitting behind us, and indeed imperial troops, imperial airmen were a key part of things like the Battle of Britain, for example, and we can see the propaganda very much emphasising that. And Winston Churchill, of course, very much was fighting a war to preserve that imperial family. And yet, of course, ironically, he becomes the image of a very British version of the war the further we get from it, because in the 1950s, 1960s, we start to get the emergence of a much more purely British narrative about what Britain did in the war. It's not that undue credit is taken for things. It's more that it's just Britain mentioned in the narrative, and it's key elements, key points in the British narrative that start to be the things that come through over and over again. And yeah, I'm sure you can all name them: the evacuation from Dunkirk, the survival in 1940, the achievements of D-Day, VE Day, and how everyone comes together to celebrate kind of the achievement in the war. There's lots of myths caught up in that, but that's the narrative around the Second World War that we have that starts to drown out narratives about the First World War, or is the cause of creating negative versions of the First World War. And then, of course, when you get to the 1960s, voices from the 1930s that now matter much more are ones that are projecting a much more negative assessment of the First World War. So, for example, the publication of Wilfred Owen's poetry, was recognised as quality poetry before the Second World War, but by the time we get to the 1960s, the 1970s, it's suddenly become the version of what the war was like. Not just the literary version, which is also an exaggeration, but just the narrative. And that was kind of the narrative of the First World War that I was taught at school, really. And had it not been for access to some of the other things at home that Neil was talking about earlier, maybe I might have been more persuaded of it at the time. And then critically, of course, David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister in Britain from the end of 1916, had a terrible personal relationship with Douglas Haig. I mean, they hated each other. They really did. I mean, they both plotted with Frenchmen to outdo the other one. That's how desperate they were, even though they both hated working with the French as well. And this idea in particular of Haig as being an idiot who didn't care about the men, who didn't know what he was doing, Lloyd George plays a key part in kind of spreading that, as does, I'm afraid, Winston Churchill as well, and his war memoirs, which some of you who know more about Churchill's First World War career than others will think is a bit rich, given perhaps if anyone we might want to write a narrative about what a disastrous war they had, we might want to write one about, and indeed they have been written, haven't they, about Churchill's war, not least the Gallipoli Dardanelles episode. So you get the emergence of this kind of very negative representation of Douglas Haig in particular as a person, but he's a lightning rod for this overall sense that Britain was run badly during the war, the men were not taken care of, the war had no purpose anyway, but of course David Lloyd George was there to make sure we won it. 1960s, we get books like The Donkeys by Alan Clark, and you probably have all heard the phrase lions led by donkeys, the idea that it was the great British populace let down by these terrible, stupid leaders, particularly on the military side. I mean, some of the authors who go down this route don't really hide their feelings at all, do they? I mean, John Laffin's book, British Butchers and Bunglers of World War One. I mean, you don't even need to read it. In fact, you don't need to read it. But I think you understand where he's coming from, don't you? And then, of course, in the 1960s, we also had the production of Oh, What a Lovely War, which is actually, I mean, although I don't necessarily agree with all the sentiments, it is a brilliant piece of work, I have to say. It does divide people. I remember must have been the 80th anniversary of the First World War, and there was a big dinner in Leeds associated with a conference that we'd had. And again, those of you who know me will know I'm not making this bit up either. Towards the end of the meal, a choir arrived. Yes, yeah. So towards the end of the meal, a choir arrived and started singing First World War songs. And the thing is, there were some very eminent, but quite ill-behaved military historians on my table, and it started to get a bit raucous on our table, I have to say. And then we did lose it, and we were laughing a bit. But one of the things I recall from afterwards is seeing that in this book of songs that we were given, that the one song that had been crossed out very, very vigorously, do not sing this song, was Oh, What a Lovely War. So lots of the other songs were used in the film as well, but because of the association of that song with the title of the production and the message he was giving about the war, someone was clearly very determined that song was not going to be sung. I was quite relieved when no more songs were being sung, I have to say. So brilliant film, brilliant production, but it is all part of that kind of negative narrative of the First World War. Now, I can't really do Lions Led by Donkeys without mentioning perhaps the most widely seen example of that, and that is Blackadder Goes Forth, which again I have to say is hugely funny. I can laugh at every episode. I'm not part of me isn't bothered about the version of the First World War that it's putting forward. Though I have to say at the time there were some of us who were deeply frustrated that something coming out in the 80s, just as we were starting to kind of counter some of the very kind of black and white versions of the First World War, was perhaps a little bit, massively unhelpful really, but very funny. I always, and this is why I chose this extract, so I always particularly laugh at the reference to Haig's tortoise, Alan. Though, to be honest, I suppose a tortoise is probably funnier than a pigeon. Though I don't know, but if he did have a pet, it was probably more likely to be a pigeon. And Neil was talking about Bruce gone again. Study visits for history students, and one we took a group to Bletchley Park, and we, having been thrown out of the post office museum for laughing and told we were going to be reported to our tutors, we then had a really enjoyable walk around the Pigeons at War exhibition there as well. No, honestly, they had medals, and then there's a really, I'm joking, there's a really serious piece of work about pigeons at war. But anyway, so I think he would have more likely had a pigeon than a tortoise. But here we've got, what's that his name, Geoffrey Palmer playing Haig, and it's pretty egregious, I think, really, where he's just kind of sweeping up soldiers in a dustpan and chucking them in the bin and that. I mean, yeah, did they need to go so far? I kind of question whether they did really need to do that. But funny programme, problem is it's perpetuating, unfortunately, a very kind of narrow view of the war. Hold on. I mentioned Wilfred Owen earlier, talked about Lloyd George. There were always literary figures and memoirists who were presenting a more nuanced version of what their war experience had been like. People like Charles Carrington in the Subaltern's War. Sorry, I'm going to have to just click through these a little bit quickly. And Guy Chapman, who, as you can see from those two quotations or quotes, as Robin would call them, they're giving perhaps a little bit more balanced version of what the war experience was like. And really, by the time I was seriously becoming a student of the First World War, as Roy Bridge lost the battle for me to do kind of bulk and special papers to Hugh Cecil's First World War paper. I never did tell Roy why I went that way. I never told Hugh, actually, either, to be honest with you. It was nothing to do with the First World War. It was actually to do with the history of the Labour Party in the 19th century. Because we were doing a module on kind of 19th, 20th century Britain. It was, I have to say, my least favourite course, as we called them in those days. And to be honest with you, I never imagined that I would end up as a university lecturer teaching a lot of British history, because I wasn't that interested in it as a student. But anyway, that's the way life takes you, isn't it? But what was that? So the reason why I converted was because Hugh entered the room to do his lecture on the rise of the Labour Party, 1880s onwards. And he did an entire lecture with slides on William Morris Doorknockers, linking this to the arts and craft movement and socialism. And I thought I couldn't have imagined a better lecture on the rise of the Labour Party, because I mean, I'd read it all before anyway, and it was not that complicated. So, and I wasn't going to do the essays on it anyway, although we can have assess work in those days. But so I thought, if you can do that, his modules, his courses must be great. So, and I thought, I'm interested in the First World War, so you know what, I went in that direction. By the time I was doing that, there was this kind of this growing debate around the learning curve idea. Now, to call it a curve is exactly. To call it a curve is that suggests there was learning all in one direction, which there wasn't. So I'm not saying that throughout the First World War, generals and politicians did continue to make mistakes, sometimes very much the same mistake. But there was learning went on as well. There was greater all-arms cooperation. There was the use of the creeping barrage, which you can see here, where eventually they got to a situation where the artillery was supporting the advance of the infantry. Better use of aerial reconnaissance, made use of radio technology, experimented and developed the use of the tank. And actually, contrary to Churchill, who talks about them being kind of technophobes, sometimes the problems were that they weren't technophobes. It's they introduced technology quickly and then had huge expectations of what it was going to do and set ambitious goals for battles, which were totally unrealistic things to set. So they weren't technophobes. They did learn lessons. And really, that was the environment in which I was coming to study the First World War with Hugh Cecil. an incredibly knowledgeable, self-effacing, kind of generous man, sadly no longer with us, owner of a beautiful home in Hampstead. I don't think there are many PhD students who get to spend 3.5 months of the year living in a plush Hampstead home, having conversations with all sorts of interesting people in the British establishment who haven't realised that Hugh isn't at home and that some odd PhD student is in residence instead. Sometimes they just come round, find he's not there, and help themselves to whiskey, all sorts of things. So it was fascinating to me, but above all, a really wonderful, supportive tutor, not just to me, but to everyone who was taught by him. And he was cultural historian, history historian. One of the things I was involved in when I first finished my PhD was he asked me to be research assistant on the book he did here on it's called The Flower of Battle. I'm afraid it doesn't show up very well on that screen there, but looking at writers from the First World War, and he didn't go for all the particularly well-known ones, but what he was doing was showing that a broad range of writers gave you a broad range of opinions on the war, and how they viewed the war depended on what had happened to them in their lives before the war, what happened during the war, and often what happened to them afterwards as well. So all sorts of different representations, and that emphasis on understanding the true human story and the variety of the human story was what struck me from the start of being taught by him. And coincidentally, as I was just about to start doing research on my undergraduate dissertation, which I did on shell shock in the British Army in the First World War, along came Dr. Peter Liddell with his archive that he developed up at Sunderland and which had been acquired by the University of Leeds. And he said, Derby, we haven't bought it, you're all right now. And put a bid in though, can we? But no, we haven't bought it, you're all right. So by the University of Leeds, and as Neil said earlier, I was in a very privileged position of meeting lots of veterans, showing them around, showing visitors around, researchers around, and then my payoff was being left with the keys to the library, Ben. And there you see that was in promotional literature for the Liddell Collection when it first came to Leeds, and in a very kind of natural pose, you see me there kind of selecting a book as with two of my colleagues from the history degree at the time, Mother Ruth and Jenny. And Peter's whole approach was around kind of capturing the variety of personal experience and building a history of the war that reflected the personal journeys that people went through. And it came from a passion to save those stories as well. So that's why we were continually getting donations, because he had all sorts of ways of reaching out into the community through kind of civic engagement. And lots of exhibitions and civic events came out of the way in which that whole operation ran as well. So archive of 6,500 different kind of sets of personal documents. I mean, it was, for me, it was a gift, and as Neil said before, was a huge reason why I chose to stay on it at least be my PhD as well. Once I completed my PhD, the first kind of publication I did was this chapter called "Not a Doctor's Work: The Role of the British Regimental Medical Officer," primarily on the Western Front. It's not in the title, but that's really what it was. And what I was doing in my research was, to some degree, unknowingly, because I wasn't very political about it, I was just getting on with doing the job of hopefully being a good historian. But what I was doing was drawing attention to the fact that there's a really positive story to tell about the First World War, as well as really horrific ones. And I can tell you, I've read all sorts of things about the horrors of wounds that were treated, how men died, listened to recordings of men recounting their emotional experiences, often for the first time in their 70s and 80s, and breaking down on tape. So none of this is to hide the horror of the reality of war, but I also saw the nuance in the experience as well. What I did in this piece, I suppose, was really demonstrate the centrality of having doctors in the front line as regimental medical officers. They were really key to the maintaining the morale of the British Army, which held up throughout the First World War, because that sense of immediate medical care was really important. But also they were part of the army's discipline. And this was one of the things that sometimes doctors found a bit difficult to get used to at first, but they were about telling men off if they weren't doing the right thing. It was inspecting that their kit was clean and dry and all the rest of it. It was doing foot inspections to make sure that problems like trench foot, which had been a particular problem earlier on, because although the trenches were providing protection from enemy fire, they were pretty rough and ready, especially the British ones to start with. So it was some while before they had kind of duck boards in there and so on, which actually started to improve the drainage. So looking after the general health of the men was really key. And the best ones were acting as a kind of a mix of a really friendly GP, a counsellor, confessor, advocate for the men. But they had to get the balance right, because, as I say, they couldn't have loads of people saying they were sick when they weren't either. So there was there were also officers as well, and that was important. There was a little bit of controversy at various times during the war about whether sending expert medical men into the front line, whether in danger of being injured or killed, was a good use of them. Generally, in the end, the debate came down on the side of it was, but perhaps you didn't want them to stay there for too long, because apart from anything else, the work was quite routine, so it wasn't developmental from a professional medical point of view. But that there are some negative literary representations of medical officers, but most of the references I've come across in letters and diaries tend to be more in alignment with what we see there in that letter to Charles McKerrow's mother, after sadly the death of Charles McKerrow, who was the regimental medical officer for the 10th Battalion Northumberland Fusiliers. So I don't think that's just about protecting the feelings of the mother who's being written to. Next thing I moved on to was really kind of looking about the fact that, you know, they had to prepare doctors for war. So they had to develop over the course of the First World War increasingly sophisticated and well-informed ways of preparing doctors to deal with the kind of injuries that they were facing, to cope with how they would maintain morale, impose discipline, understand the bureaucracy of the army as well. You know, obviously doctors today are much more used to dealing with bureaucracy because they're part of the National Health Service. But these were independent businessmen. They weren't used to kind of working in a bureaucratic sense. They kept their own records and in their own way. There was a bit of an assumption early on in the war, and it's captured. And Warwick Deeping was a writer who, being a doctor, then when the war came along, decides to be a doctor again, and then once the war's over, he goes back to be a writer. And his book, No Hero This, has a kind of a medic as a central character, and one of the things that he gets told quite early on, which I'm guessing is something that Deeping himself heard from people, was the idea that, well, doctors wouldn't need any special training because you're a doctor already. We just stick a uniform on you and you go off and do what you know you need to do. And there was a gradual recognition that was not going to be sufficient, and the sense of it not really being absolute preparation you get from some of those quotations on the screen there. So as I say, during the course of the war, there was a development of more sophisticated training, particularly focusing upon hygiene and sanitation, because that in particular was what doctors were not used to looking after. And yet what the army really needed was to make sure, yes, of course, we've got to deal with the wounded, but what we really need to do is make sure that men aren't necessarily out of combat use. So we don't want people going down with preventable illnesses. So understanding how you avoid those, inspect those. And so lots of stuff that a lot of doctors thought was a bit beneath them, really. That's the kind of thing that medical officers of health do, who they were seen as, the bit lower down the professional ladder by many of the men who went off to fight. So training on that was really important. There was the establishment of the RAMC School of Hygiene at Blackpool, then on the Western Front at the base hospitals, creation of specialist training centres as well. So Geoffrey Keyes, brother of the Economist, went on to be absolutely central to the popularisation of blood transfusion in Britain after the war. And again, you can see from that quotation there how he was able to develop his career as well. So increasingly what we had was support for doctors to develop specialism and increasing kind of recognition of specialism, reluctantly to a degree by the War Office and the Army, because they tended to think in terms of doctors rather than specialist surgeons or areas of specialist expertise. But that does start to develop as the war progresses. So again, ways in which they're learning about what they needed to do, adapting to circumstances. Then I went on to write a book looking at the experience of doctors more broadly in the First World War. One of the key things I looked at was that balancing of the needs of the army with the needs of the civilian population and how that was managed. And actually, it was managed uniquely through a partnership between the profession and the government. So even after 1916, when conscription comes in for the vast majority of the population, it didn't come in for doctors. Instead, professional committees, which had been set up to manage the voluntary period, continued into compulsory conscription. And what these committees did, and they had an overall national committee, of course, and local committee sitting beneath the structure. All started in Scotland. The Scottish profession was a little bit ahead of England and Wales, but they caught up and followed a very similar model. They looked at where gaps were and who could fill the gaps, and then if that gap had been filled, then maybe we can send that doctor off to the army. So yeah, it became a mechanism for balancing the needs of the home and fighting fronts. Though I have to say, a lot of the motivation for the creation of the committees in the first place came from concern from doctors that if they did go off to fight, the doctor down the road who didn't would steal all their patients while they were away. So it was also about kind of protecting their business interests as well. The other thing that came through from the voluntary period, and I've just selection of quotations there, which just give you that sense again that doctors, like the rest of the population, were caught up in a variety of motives as to why they went off to fight, and elements of referencing patriotism. Others talked about humanitarian concern, or just generally wanting to use their medical expertise and place that at the disposal of the nation. I've not been too sure about Dibble, to be honest. I left England filled with the anticipation of cutting off legs and arms upon the Strickland field. That sounds a bit too keen to me. But what I also looked at in the book was really the success on the Western Front of the way in which the army mobilised medical personnel to look after the men for the most part. Yes, there were failings, shell shock being the most obvious one where things could have improved at a better pace. Though I have to say, look at other armies, Britain didn't do too badly actually, and in a way that the foundation of the experience in the First World War leads into a much more positive attitude to those things in the second. But yeah, in all other respects, kind of really effective countering of disease. So this was the first war where there were fewer deaths from disease than there were from enemy action. That's a major breakthrough, certainly a transformation from the state of things that they've been during the Crimean War, where Florence Nightingale was killing them all in a hospital. Sorry, she was, and the Boer War, of course, as well. And during both of those wars and in between, the British Medical Association, through the pages of the British Medical Journal, was fighting a perpetual war against the Army Medical Service and the Royal Army Medical Corps. It became from 1898 as it was reformed and improved itself. And so I think that shows you the significance of the fact that in 1918, the British Medical Journal was publishing such a positive assessment of the achievements of the the Royal Army Medical Corps between 14 and 18. I can promise you it wouldn't have done that if it wasn't true, because patriotism didn't stop it being very angry during the Crimean War and the Boer War publicly in the pages of the British Medical Journal. I'm not one for remembering stats or even going on about stats too much, but there's the statistics on the screen there kind of also show you that most men actually came back from the First World War. We forget that. and actually the number of who died from wounds is perhaps a smaller percentage than sometimes people think. Again, none of this is to diminish the actual suffering of the experience that people went through, but I think sometimes our collective understanding of the numbers involved has been skewed, particularly by things like the lost generation of Oxbridge graduates and so on, who again were a small percentage of the population. As I said before, there was some growing recognition of medical specialisation and advancement of knowledge. Mostly it was knowledge they already had, so blood transfusions, things like that. They knew how to do those before the war, but not many people knew how to do it. So it started to popularise the techniques involved. This was the route of evacuation on the Western Front, as it was intended. Casualty clearing station. So you have the regimental bearers, mentioned before, regimental aid post. What it hasn't got on there is the field ambulances that came just before the motor ambulance. That was where the main and field dressing stations were. And then to these casualty clearing stations, which were really meant to be temporary, easily moved places, and clearing station, the word really was about kind of triaging the patients, deciding who was worth saving, who could be saved, and then getting them on trains back to the base hospitals. What happened as a result of trench warfare is that those casualty clearing stations, instead of being mobile, increasingly became stable units. And what they then started to do was use those forward casualty clearing stations that had meant to just be receiving centres and turn them into places where early treatment of wounds could take place. And Sir Anthony Bowlby, who came in as one of the consultant surgeons. So again, this is where we got kind of civilian surgeons and physicians collaborating with the Army Medical Service, with the War Office, started to push the case for more surgery happening in the clearing stations. There was the organisation of surgical teams, which again we take for granted today, that when you go in for an operation, there's an anaesthetist and a surgeon and medical orderlies and sisters and so on. That was a model that came out of the First World War. So that is new. That whole organisational thing is new, more so than some of the medical knowledge that was actually popularised. And as a result of that, more surgery did start to take place in the forward lines, and they learnt the importance of doing proper surgery as well, because in the Boer War, they tended to leave wounds because they hadn't get infected with microbes and so on from agricultural soil, because it wasn't agricultural soil that they were fighting over, and the nature of the bullet wounds was different. The kind of wounds that they faced in the First World War, they quickly realised if you just left those and had this conservative approach, then gangrene set in and lots of limbs were understandably lost as a consequence of that. So under Bowlby, it's put through this forward surgery, and you can see how the forward surgery kind of increased in its rate as the war progressed. We had the move to kind of wound excision, taking kind of dead tissue out, making sure there were no foreign bodies in there, and having them what they call delayed primary suture, so they didn't close the wound completely until they were sure that it was a clean wound, and that had a huge transformative effect on survival rates, and also began to reduce the number of cases where there were amputations of limbs. Other innovations, as well as things like the introduction of the Thomas splint, Robert Jones. Robert Jones was instrumental in that, and again, the introduction of that saw a massive reduction in the deaths from fractures, from I think from 80% not surviving to only 20% not surviving. So really quite transformative. Perhaps something that others of you might already be aware of is the breakthroughs in plastic surgery as well. Particularly from the Second World War, the work of Archibald Mackindoe and the Guinea Pig Club from the RAF is perhaps better known, but actually it's the work of Harold Gillies in the First World War that was kind of laid the foundations for that. Great things were achieved. I have to say, sometimes reading the letters and diaries of the patients, some of them, even though they're transformed by the end of the process, often say they would rather have died, and they did indeed feel like guinea pigs. But huge achievements in terms of the development of plastic surgery. Quickly, Battle of Passchendaele, archetypal images of the First World War associated with that, particularly the difficulties of moving the wounded in the very muddy conditions of July and then again kind of October of 1917 at the time of the Third Battle of Ypres. They had particularly unseasonable weather. Whether or not they should have known that and how they should have responded to those conditions becomes part of the debate about whether the battle should ever have been fought, should it have been stopped sooner, and who's responsible for that, and is it Haig or is it Lloyd George, and when was the right thing to do. And I can tell you that book doesn't reach a definitive conclusion itself. There's also different views represented within it. But what I was able to do is to show that despite those debates, put those debates to one side, the development of the medical expertise continued to advance right through 1917 in terms of the quality of the surgery that was taking place, the life-saving impact, improvements to sanitation. So they stopped sanitary units moving with their division and instead gave them an area that they were permanently responsible for. So they got to know that area and where the threats to health were and made sure the preventative measures were in place. They had increasingly specialised lines of evacuation for cases. So head wounds might all go to one casualty clearing station. Suspected shell shock cases might go to others. They also were dropping the term shell shock because it was unhelpful anyway. So again, lots of ways in which they continued to move things forward. There were some risks with this because increasingly these casualty clearing stations were well within range of enemy fire, and some were hit. And again, then there were debates about whether there was deliberate German action or whether this was just a risk we'd taken by placing them where they were. And then, of course, in 1918, as we moved back to rapid kind of movement, this whole model of having the casualty clearing stations becomes untenable because then they're just not they're not mobile enough. But lots of positive developments is really what I was trying to summarise. This talk isn't about the wars as being socially transformative, and in particular references. And I'm going to have to take my notes. So I get these organisations. I'm not going to put these ladies in the wrong organisation. So WSPU and then UWSS. I'm going to make sure I put the right people in the right one. So the Women's Hospital Corps. So Louisa Garrett Anderson and Flora Murray came out of the Women's Social and Political Union. And then the Scottish Women's Hospital, led by Elsie Inglis, came out of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. The British Army wasn't interested in women doctors, frankly. The Serbs and the French, they said, yeah, come on over. So the Scottish Women's Hospitals went to France, they went to Serbia, they went to Salonika, setting up hospitals. Women's Hospital Corps were based primarily in France. Eventually the War Office kind of said, well, they seem to be all know what they're doing, and they give them a hospital to run at Endell Street in London. And as the war progresses and they get more and more concerned about the British are enough doctors, then they start to train more women, and suddenly medical schools that said we can't have women medical students here, kind of let them in. But the problem is once the war's over, there are no opportunities for those women who qualify in the early 1920s. So we spend all that time training them, and then there's no jobs for them. So they disappear from the profession. And in the Second World War, far from there being advanced, there's no going overseas for women doctors in an organised way because the army still doesn't want to do that. And the women's movement has actually gone into reverse in the 20s and 30s. So those networks that I just mentioned that helped to mobilise the women in 1914-18, they've gone. So women's medical contribution is quite hidden on the home front in the Second World War. And until 1944, when legislation comes in to stop it, some of the medical schools in London still did not accept any female medical students. And even after that, they only took a quota, so it was very tokenistic. I did a book called The Great World War, and I was always a bit tentative about this title because I didn't want it to give people the impression that we were saying that it was just the same war or that the Second World War was inevitable, it was always going to happen. But we went for the title because it was about trying to talk about that continuum that I mentioned before. And what a lot of the contributors also draw attention to, and the exhibition that you see a picture of there that went alongside it, was again the variety of personal experience, and the fact that actually sometimes people had a similar experience in the Second World War to what some people had had in the First, that was actually different to what other people were having in the Second World War. So that kind of sense of variety. And then my own contribution with Professor Nick Bosanquet was really picking up on some of the things I've alluded to right the way through the lecture so far, which is that sense of lessons taught in the First World War being built upon in the Second. Though I would say one lesson that they really didn't learn right away was that one about battle fatigue and shell shock, just to use that term, because the army didn't go into the Second World War with any better kind of sense of a psychiatric preparation than it had previously. Talked about myth busting in the Second World War before, and again through the Second World War Experience Centre, which Neil mentioned my association with earlier. I did do some of that kind of challenging of the idea of everyone celebrating the VE Day. I mean, if you read accounts of what people were doing in Leeds on VE Day, you'll find there was nothing to do. We see that kind of, yes, morale held up, but then some British cities, much smaller than London, the impact of the bombing was therefore more impactful on people's communities. And yeah, communities came together to a degree, but also it literally blew communities apart, and they weren't restored. Yes, ideas come out of the Second World War about kind of creating a better society, but actually not as strongly as you might think, and that any consensus around that, if there was ever one, broke down quite quickly. I realise I'm not managing my time very well, but I'll try and speed up a little bit so that you actually get out of the building soon. So I do just want to draw attention to achievements of some students, some of whom are in the room. Very ambitious for our students here at Derby, and two students of mine, Andrew Syke and Rebecca Pine Edwards Banks, were placed in the Royal Historical Society's undergraduate dissertation prize. Andrew highly commended, and Becky, who's there, pictures as you see with the editor of History Today, won the prize. What Andrew drew attention to was all those myths about how bad the generals were in the First World War, showed how lessons were learned. Yes, mistakes continued to be made. And I do like his conclusion, which is to say not to acknowledge what they learned is really not to acknowledge the achievements of the men themselves, let alone what you think of the generals. What Becky drew attention to was the fact that all those committees that existed to deal with the issue of conscientious objection were actually not some horrible group of people who were forcing men off to war, but were actually managing the interests of individuals and their claim to make a conscientious objection. They were also managing the needs of the nation. You know, if we send the last village butcher off to fight, then we're not going to have a butcher in the village. So are we going to send him? Probably we're not going to. So there's a whole set of nuanced decisions that they were actually making. And then one of our PhD students, Jane Flynn, drew attention to the fact that horses, far from the myths that you might be aware of with the First World War, continue to play a really important part in the success of the British forces. We have here also a second year student conference every year since 2008, where second year students research a topic. And in 2014, it was on the theme of the Great War. And so incredible was the standard of the work that we had them published in an edited volume. We even had a book launch down in the atrium with a cake, of course, but have a cake at a book launch. And yeah, as you can see from those posters, there's a whole variety of themes that the students tackled around identity. And again, they didn't have a common view. So the common thing was understanding and wanting to understand different stories, not telling the same story. And I think the key thing to understand about, there's lots of nonsense in the press at the moment about the value of humanities degrees and so on. What we teach students to do is not what to think, but ways of thinking, and get students to kind of step back from knee-jerk reactions to things, to put things in perspective, to look at evidence and to see that there might be many and several ways of experiencing something, many and several ways of viewing it. And that's really what I've really always tried to do in my academic career as well, in my writing. So I know I'm heading to my conclusion, Paul. So you don't need to wave at me. I'm nearly there. I am nearly there. I promise. Yeah. So this takes me to David Cameron. I know. I was going to say remember him, but he's back, isn't he? So in 2012, when he was launching the plans for the centenary commemoration, he talked in these terms about trying to create a national sense of celebration around the First World War. There were lots of really good quality commemorative events that took place, and I was privileged to be involved in a number of those myself. The town of Ashbourne, just up the road, did a full week of celebrations. They set up the little community hospital that they'd had, and I went and did a talk about medicine in the war. One of my students from many years ago now, Margaret Taylor, invited me to an exhibition that she put on in Elliston Parish Church. Lots of really good publications and funded research and community projects that came out of the commemoration. So in that sense, I think, it did work. It did have value, and that bit of what Cameron was looking for succeeded. There were others like, I haven't even mentioned this, Michael Gove, who wanted to see a much more muscular version of Britishness being presented through all of this, and was very worried about lefties in the universities and schools who will be stopping this kind of patriotic view of the war being presented. Totally missing the fact that most of the biggest attacks upon whether the war was worth fighting have come from historians from the right, people like Neil Ferguson, for example, with his pity of it all and idea that Britain should have just watched and continued to look after its empire in an I'm all right gov kind of fashion. But I think those hopes for building a sense of Britishness around it were always going to be really challenging, because as I've established many and several times during the course of this talk now, the First World War is a hugely contested event, and there's a very powerful image of what it is. And on top of that, Britishness is a very contested thing, and indeed part of the reason why the government was jumping on any opportunity in that period, I think, is understandable given uncertainties about where Britain's going in the world. So I think the legacy of the commemorations, to my mind, and this is a point I make in this most recent chapter I've written, is that, it's led to lots of really good research. It has led to lots of community engagement. More people than ever perhaps showing an interest in their family history. And when they do that, they see the variety of experience that people had. But they don't associate the variety of their individual family members' experience with their overall narrative of the First World War. And so I do think it's going to be some time yet, if ever, that the Wilfred Owen, lion led by donkeys, Blackadder versions of the war disappear from the popular mind. And some of you might think that's a good thing, because maybe it's good we've got a version of warfare that reminds us how awful warfare really is. On the other hand, we might say it's a bad thing because stark generalizations about the past mean we don't learn the right kind of lessons or learn any lessons. And we also tend to gloss over the reality of what it is to go through those kind of experiences. And to go back to the point that Andrew Syke mentioned in his article that I cited a moment ago, is it perhaps really also not just to diminish the leaders, but to diminish those who fought, who made the weapons, who made all sorts of sacrifices during that First World War to ultimately achieve victory. I'll leave it there. Thank you.